Thank you. Sorry, first I want to apologize for my voice. I'm getting over a cold. But our talk today is about Cash's Ledge and the Coral Canyons and Seamounts Monument. And we want to talk about how they're healthy ecosystems and how these healthy ecosystems are really going to be a way for us to kind of counter the climate changes and adapt to the climate changes as time goes on. So first we would like to start with the question, what does a healthy ecosystem look like? So usually for a healthy ecosystem, you would want to have a good physical environment. In a marine context, this means that the water quality would be good. Any kind of bad parameters would cause a lot of stress for the fish. Another thing would be good structure and substrate. So good structure is, homes for the fish, places for them to have their various life stages, events. Also, no pollution or any heavy metals or toxins. Those all have adverse effects, obviously. And even the substrate is really important because it houses a healthy bacterial community to perform all these essential environmental functions. Another thing that a healthy ecosystem should have is a rich and biodiverse life. You have the keystone species, which are the ones that are most important for maintaining and restoring ecosystems and providing functions that cause them to continue to be a good place for animals and plants to live. Some things are less than desirable, such as invasive species, like the green crabs and lionfish. Also, some that have little value, but they compete with resources for things like jellyfish. And also, too much of one thing can be a bad thing. For example, algae. As we were talking about, algae is very important. It performs photosynthesis and handles a lot of the carbon in our atmosphere and our oceans. But too much of it would, exhaust all the oxygen and cause massive die-offs. Another thing that you look for in a healthy ecosystem is an absence of disease outbreaks and pests. A healthy environment shouldn't have too much occasions of disease. And finally, and most importantly perhaps, is balance. You really need to balance everything out. If you have too much of any of these good parameters, that can make things not work out as well. If you have too many fish but not enough habitat, you start to come across problems. So basically, these are the things that we're looking at for a healthy ecosystem. It's what we define it by. So now I'm going to pass the mic off to Sarah, who's going to talk to us about the Coral Canyons and Seamounts Monument, and we'll discuss why that's a healthy ecosystem.
So, the New England's Coral Canyons and Seamounts, for those of you who don't know, is an area about 150 miles off the coast of Cape Cod, and it's basically an incredible case study for everything that Sarah just talked about, in addition to a few other things that other speakers have brought up. So, like I said, it's incredibly close. It's basically in our backyard. And it is this range of underwater mountains that is home to some of the most impressive biodiversity in the northern Atlantic. And just one of the incredible geographic features that makes it so distinct are these just incredible, massive mountains and the accompanying canyons, which are home to incredible biodiversity that was first explored, or seriously explored and analyzed in 2014 with a NOAA Okeanos Explorer expedition, and those resources of just realizing that these areas that hadn't really been categorized or cataloged have just amazing biodiversity and plant life. And it's an ideal environment to use for how special this place is in terms of both scientific and aesthetic use, because as you'll see, this is some pretty amazing biodiversity. It's everything from obviously corals to hydromusae to cephalopods like the Dumbo octopus in the upper left. And even more recently, with a bit more of a serious conservation bent, there have been studies released showing that these are wintering grounds for Atlantic puffin, which is a species that we need to be paying attention to, especially in this region. And also, it's very close to, if not the mating grounds for populations of endangered bluefin tuna. So obviously any area that we can use to preserve and protect these breeding grounds of species we're trying to maintain for my generation and future generations is a great idea. So although there is this amazing biodiversity, it's a really easy thing to not know about, and I'm a prime example of that. This is as much a case study in why we need to conserve these areas as much as it is how easy it is to both not know and then quickly care about them. Like, I had not heard about this before interning with the Conservation Law Foundation in June, but since then it's become second nature to me to understand why this area is important and necessary to my lifestyle, your lifestyle, and the lifestyle of the region as a whole. And simply because it's covered underwater doesn't mean it's not important to be educating my generation and future generations about. And that's going to become so much easier now because as of the Our Oceans conference this year, President Obama announced it as the Atlantic's first national monument under the Antiquities Act. Which is, awesome. And what exactly was protected was 4,913 square miles, which is a huge area. That's absolutely incredible. And it's also an indication that there's a key part to all healthy ecosystems that we need to consider, and that's people. It's very easy for us to pass pieces of legislation like this where climate change resiliency is now feasible because we have a massive national park about 150 miles from here that is permanently protected and is now going to become a safe haven for the for the fish and other animals that have been using it as a home or mating area for who knows how long. But now that's a permanent protection, and that's really incredible when you think about the educational possibilities of that. And how did that happen? It is a pretty much direct result of individuals collaborating on all levels of government as well as through NGOs and advocacy to develop an effective preservation plan. And this conversation is continuing with how to extend this conservation behavior into other areas. This was just the first area in the Atlantic that was established as necessary to protect as a national park. And up next, we're going to be looking at Cash's Ledge, which is probably an area more impressive biodiversity-wise. It's been called basically the Yellowstone of the Atlantic, to put it in perspective of just how rich in biodiversity these areas that we are protecting. And how it's so easy to do if there is that collaboration and active conversation going on between both generations and branches of government and non-governmental agencies. So now other Sarah is going to be telling you all about caches.
Can you tell us your last names, which is which?
Sorry.
Yes.
Zeiberg.
And I'm Valencik. Yes. Right, so I will be talking to you about Cash's Ledge. Many of you might have heard about Cash's Ledge. It's been in the news the past couple of years. But just to give you an introduction, it's located about 80 miles east of Cape Ann in the central part of the Gulf of Maine. You can see on the map here, the map on the left. It was designated a hope spot by renowned scientist Dr. Sylvia Earle. And as she mentioned, it's also called the Yellowstone of the North Atlantic for its diverse terrain and which houses an extremely high biodiversity and a really healthy environment. It's out in the open ocean, and it's pretty hard to get to. The only people who really have been out there have been commercial fishermen. As you can see, the ledge runs roughly parallel to shore, and it features this rugged horseshoe mountain area there in the middle, where the highest peak is Almond Rock. You can see it right there. It's only 40 feet below the surface of the water, which is pretty incredible. If you look, you can see there's a lot of deep water all around. And then you have these mountains that come so close to the ocean surface. On Almond Rock and some of the other peaks, they're covered by the largest contiguous kelp forest in the Northeast, which is pretty incredible because, again, we are talking about the middle of the ocean. Cassius Ledge is a complete ecosystem with every bottom of type of the Gulf of Maine found here. So from rocky peaks, you go downslope, there's boulder and cobble fields, and then below you've got sedimentary layers with sand and cobble and mud basins. So many different homes for many different creatures. Some people think that some of these habitats have more value than other of habitats, but the honest truth is that life is found throughout. Each has its own community of species that thrive in the habitat, and they play their part in the greater ecosystem. Some other features you get with the varied topography. You have steep drop-offs, banks and channels. Currents circulate through these areas and create a very dynamic physical environment that supports the life of this ecosystem. One characteristic that Cassius Ledge has is a phenomenon called internal waves. And basically you have these really deep cold water spots, and you also have much warmer, shallower water that's full of nutrition and phytoplankton, zooplankton, and the currents that move around the ledge, along with the different water density between the cold and the hot water, create these internal waves. And it's described as a food elevator. Basically, it causes the cold water to rise up and the nutrient-rich warm water to go down. Some divers to the ledge have experienced these waves as sudden water temperature changes. They can change as much as 5 degrees Celsius in 10 minutes, just to give you an idea about how incredible this is. And it happens multiple, sometimes even as many times as 20 times a day. The internal waves not only provide food for the depths, but it also allows deeper life to live at shallower depths and vice versa. For example, one of the deepest seaweed communities in the world is found at Cassius. And the result of all of this is a highly dynamic, healthy environment with very good water quality. So for the ecology, the Cassius Ledge is full of an incredible abundance and rich diversity of life. One of the most important players here is kelp. As I said, the largest contiguous kelp forest in the Northeast is found here at Cassius Ledge. It's very deep. It grows as deep as 30 meters, that's 90 feet. The kelp itself is very tall. Some of the fronds are 30 feet tall. And it's also extremely dense. They have about 40 plants per square meter located up here, and that's 100 times more dense than you'd find in a coastal site. And this all creates a dark protected canopy / understory habitat for just a whole variety of life. A lot of fish use it as a nursery, and it's home to just many others who can find a place like between the fronds or down near the holdfasts. And though the kelp only covers a small portion of the ledge, its effect is felt throughout, because every summer there is a seasonal die-off of the kelp, and the dead kelp matter, which is called detritus, sinks down to the lower habitats and serves as an important food source for the life down there. Almond Rock, the place that I had pointed out before, is covered in kelp, and one diver visiting the peak said diving on Almond Rock is to be enveloped in biology. Today you can find some lobsters and crabs there, but Dr. Bob Stenek, who studied the area for the past almost 30 years, said that in the late 80s there were virtually none to be found. And the reason was because there was a lot of brown fish in the area, and they were eating all of the crabs and lobsters up. Groundfish used to be the Gulf of Maine's dominant species before they were overfished. The most famous groundfish of all is cod. The other groundfish species are halibut, flounder, white hake. We've heard their names, but the cod are the iconic species of the Northeast. They were our dominant fishery for over 300 years. The Gulf of Maine in particular was famed for their abundance, but now their population is feared to be dangerously low. Cod in the Gulf of Maine face many challenges: warming ocean temperatures, less prey, a limited gene pool due to historic overfishing, and continued fishing pressure, even as a non-targeted species. And the pictures here, the one on the upper left and the one below it, those are both cod, just to let you know. We've got pollock, white hake in the middle, and flounder here. Also, another thing that's not in the favor of cod is that they start to spawn when they're between 3 and 4 years old, which is kind of old for a fish. Not as old as halibut, which is 8 years. But even then, it takes multiple spawnings for them to start producing really healthy and more abundant eggs. So one thing that you hear a lot about when people talk about cod is BOFF, and that's big, old, fat females. They are considered the brood stock for the Gulf of Maine. They produce a lot of eggs that are very healthy and have a better rate of survival. And Cash's Ledge is one of the last refuges for these big old fat females. In fact, almost every stage of life a fish is found at Cash's Ledge. It's that diverse. And the cod use the muddy basins as spawning grounds. And they also like the deep areas because it's a lot cooler down there than it is up on the surface. The number of groundfish that are found at Cash's are significantly higher than in surrounding waters. Cash's has got 500 times the fish biomass of any nearby coastal site. So it's pretty incredible. And also interesting, a new study released by Dr. George Sherwood and John Grabowski talk about different populations of cod. One of the big arguments about marine protected areas is that fish don't know where the boundaries are and they can swim in and out of them. But these two scientists have really studied these cod, and they've discovered there's different populations. There's like a resident they call couch potato cod, and then there's the transients. The resident cods are like the big old fat females, and they tend to prefer closed areas. And the fish caught in the survey troughs are consistently older, longer, fatter, with fuller bellies than the transients. Also in the studies, Cash's being far from shore, it had a much more complete age structure than any of the other areas surveyed. Some of the other types of creatures that you can find at Cash's Ledge, besides just cod, you've got the pollock, squid, mackerel, herring, tuna, billfish, sharks. Of the sharks, there's many different kinds. There's blue porbeagle, basking sharks, seabirds, marine mammals. The northern right whale comes here. In fact, their habitat designation was recently expanded, and it's now right smack in the middle of the whale critical habitat. We also get humpbacks, minke, and pilot whales, and there's dolphins. On the bottom, one scientist described the bottom life at Cash's as colors typically associated with the coral reef rather than cold northern environment. You have multicolored sponges, sea anemones, sea stars, brittle stars, tube worms, northern shrimp, and horse mussels. There's just so many different kinds. And I have a few pictures here. We've got the blue shark and the basking shark in the middle up top, the northern right whale with its twin spout. On the far left, that's a wolffish, which is an endangered species. It's kind of a weird-looking fish. It swims like an eel, sort of. The bluefin tuna. And then here are some of the multicolored anemones that you can find down at Cash's Ledge. So even though this place is very remote and hard to get to, there's still been a lot of human interest in the area. Cash's was obviously fished quite a bit during the heyday of New England fishing. But it wasn't really fished too much in the modern era, with our draggers and trawlers. It's because fishermen were afraid that they would snag their nets on all the underwater obstructions on the ledge. But in the late 1980s, early 90s, the technology improved, and they were able to use the draggers and the dredgers and go through and fish Cash's Ledge. But thankfully in 2002, Cash's Ledge was closed to all commercial bottom fishing due to lobbying pressure by environmental groups. They still allow commercial fishing of lobster, herring, tuna, swordfish, but those are all midwater or surface fisheries, whereas all bottom tending gear has been stopped. There's also still some recreational fishing, mostly head boats, which are, somebody pays $100 to go out with 50 other people to go out fishing out there. But with the moratorium that was put on cod in 2014, there are fewer and fewer of those boats that go out there. And for people with their own boats, it's really too far and too expensive to get out there. So Cash's Ledge, as I mentioned, is a closed area. It was almost reopened a couple of years ago. The New England Fisheries Management Council was redoing its habitat designations, and Cash's Ledge got put on the chopping block. The fishing industry was obviously very keen to go back to Cash's Ledge, where there's well-documented huge numbers of cod and other ground fish. But thankfully, it was not reopened. People had talked about fishing the unimportant habitats like mud basins, but there are some merits to a truly intact ecosystem, and to just hack at portions of it, might affect the overall balance. Fortunately, the Fishery Management Council folks agreed, and they protected it. But something to think about is that during that habitat amendment, Cash's was saved, but protected habitats were slashed by 60%. Georges Bank was the hardest hit, so nothing is truly ever safe for long. Most recently, as we had mentioned, Cash's was considered as a candidate to become an Atlantic Marine Monument, but there was too much controversy surrounding it, so he opted for the canyons. Conservation groups still hope to permanently protect Cash's, as Sarah mentioned, and they are still vulnerable. I mean, perhaps they're safe from fishing, but they are still vulnerable to other industrial interests like sand and gravel mining, and though it's less likely up here, gas and oil exploration. So the short story is, despite being a remote place, there are many parties interested in it with different motivations and interests. However, fully protected marine areas are healthier and are better able to resist the effects of climate change. So that brings me to the subject of climate change. Climate change is a significant challenge for the Gulf of Maine. As somebody mentioned, it's warming faster than 99% of the oceans in the world. And why is that, you may wonder? Well, first, there's been a gradual northward shift of the Gulf Current. Also, atmospheric warming caused in part by greenhouse gases. And controversially, people talk about climate cycles reaching a warming phase. What these warmer temperatures mean to the Gulf of Maine is that it's going to cause a lot of challenges and cause stress to the organisms. They're already well adapted to the current temperatures. They're going to have to adapt again. Cod, a lot of people talk about cod. The temperatures will affect the success of their larval recruitment. Less food is available. The larvae may have to go to colder waters where they're more vulnerable to predation. They will also need increasing metabolic energy to survive, in a lower food, more stressed environment. And honestly, New England's really already at the southernmost end of their range, so they're getting pushed northward. For lobsters and crabs, the warming temperatures will make them more susceptible to shell disease. And warm water also brings new species and new competitors. The kelp is affected. It reduces abundance and kills back more kelp every year during the die-off. But warming isn't the only thing that's affecting Cash's Ledge. We also have ocean acidification. What is it? Ocean acidification is that the ocean absorbs atmospheric CO2, and the CO2 meeting the water forms carbonic acid, which renders the pH of the ocean more acidic. Oceans will always absorb carbon, whether they have the phytoplankton or the plants to handle the excess carbon. It'll take it in. It's just a normal chemical reaction. Shellfish, corals, and to some extent lobsters and crabs have problems developing strong shells and skeletons. And obviously the different water chemistry will affect many aspects of the creatures' lives in ways that we probably haven't figured out yet. So what can the Gulf of Maine do to combat these warming temps and ocean acidification? Well, healthy ecosystems have the best chance of survival and recovery. High biodiversity ensures better chances as well. Basically, with high biodiversity, you have different answers to different problems. You can adapt to things. And not all your eggs are in one basket, so if, say you lose 5 or 10 species, it's not going to be completely devoid of life. Perhaps one of the biggest strengths or asset in the Gulf of Maine is its high productivity. As we mentioned, we have those huge kelp gardens, and they are performing a lot of photosynthesis, but there's also tons of phytoplankton. It's a very rich primary production area. And it's interesting, I found out that marine plants produce between 70 and 80% of the oxygen in the atmosphere, and 50% of that comes from the smallest, the phytoplankton. And all told, algae produces around 330 billion tons of oxygen a year. So it's really important that we encourage these areas to continue doing these functions and to, not kill everything with too much nitrogen and not mow down the kelp beds and everything. So we really need places like this to keep up the good work, basically. That's all I have. Do you have anything else to say?
That about wraps it up.
All right, that about wraps it up. Thank you.